At 19, Audra was a widow, an orphan, and the possessor of $7.43, a worn German shepherd named Fen, and a deed to a place that had been scraped off every map for a reason. What do you do when the only thing you have left is a place that doesn't exist? You pack your grief in a burlap sack, you tie your hope to your bootlaces, and you start walking. The letter had arrived not by post, but by hand, delivered by the aunt who had taken her in after her parents' fever and her husband's fall had left her utterly alone in the world. Aunt Martha had held the yellowed envelope between a thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead mouse, her face a mask of sour duty. This came for your grandfather, years ago. I saw no sense in troubling a child with it. Now you're of an age, and of a circumstance, where you might as well have it. It's likely nothing but more trouble. Audra had taken it without a word. She knew trouble. Trouble was the rough calico of the dresses her aunt provided, the thinness of the soup, the ache in her back from dawn until dusk. Trouble was a familiar weight. Inside the envelope was the deed, the paper cracked at the folds, and a short, simple letter in a script she faintly recognized. It was her grandfather's hand, a man she remembered only in flashes of scent and sound, pipe tobacco, the rasp of a whetstone, a low, patient voice. He had died when she was 6. She unfolded the letter. My dearest Audra, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the world has likely not been gentle. I leave you all I have, a place of your own. Sorrowful Creek. The name is a lie, but a necessary one. It is in the Cinderwood Basin, 2 days' walk west of the rail spur at Prosperity. Follow the dry wash until you see a lone spire of granite that looks like a thumb pointing to the sky. The path begins there. The land is yours. What you do with it is yours also. Trust what I taught you. Your loving grandfather, Thomas. She did not remember much of what he had taught her, the memories buried under a decade of servitude and sorrow. But one thing surfaced, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. A summer afternoon by a real creek, not a dry one, her small hand in his large, calloused one. He had picked up a flat, grey river stone. Look close, little bird, he'd murmured, his voice a low rumble. The world is full of things that look the same. You must learn to see what doesn't belong. See that line of white? That's quartz. It tells a story. Everything that's different tells a story. He had pressed a stone into her palm, one just like it, small and smooth with a lightning strike of white quartz through its heart. She still had it, tucked into the pocket of her skirt, its familiar weight a tiny anchor. She did not cry when she left her aunt's house. She did not look back. She simply filled a sack with a tin plate, a cup, a small skillet, a half loaf of bread, and a wedge of hard cheese. She counted her coins one last time, $7 silver and the clutch of pennies and dimes, and slipped them into a small leather pouch. Then she called to Fen, who rose from his spot on the porch, his liquid brown eyes fixed on her face, his tail giving a single, solemn thump against the floorboards. He was the only living thing that had ever looked at her with uncomplicated affection. They walked west. The first day was across open prairie, the sun a merciless hammer on the back of her neck. The grass was scorched brown, and the air was thick with dust that coated her tongue and gritted in her teeth. Fen trotted beside her, his head low, his pink tongue lolling. They shared water from her canteen, Audra pouring a little into her cupped hand for him, and they shared the bread at midday, sitting in the thin shade of a solitary, skeletal cartonwood. The world was vast and empty, and for the first time in 10 years, the emptiness felt less like a void and more like a clean, open page. She walked until her feet were raw, and when the sun finally bled out across the horizon, she wrapped herself in her thin blanket, her head on her sack, and lay with Fen's warm, solid body pressed against her back, his soft breathing a comfort in the immense silence. The second day, the land began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, the faint, blue-grey smudge of mountains appeared. She found the rail spur at Prosperity, which was little more than a water tower, a small station house, and a single siding where a lone freight car sat rusting. The station master, a man with a face like a dried apple, barely looked at her when she asked for the direction of the Cinderwood Basin. He just jerked a thumb west. Nothing out there but snakes and disappointment, miss, he'd said, his voice rusty. "Folks call it the Scablands." She thanked him and kept walking, following the deep, sandy groove of a dry wash that snaked toward the rising hills. The sun was lower now, the air cooler. And then she saw it. To the north, rising from a jumble of lesser rocks, was a single spire of granite, stark against the deepening twilight sky. It looked exactly like a thumb. A signpost left by a ghost. A surge of something that felt dangerously like hope tightened her chest. She turned off the wash, her boots sinking into the softer soil, and began to climb toward the rock. Fen bounded ahead, his weariness forgotten, his nose to the ground. He stopped at the base of the spire and looked back at her, whining softly. There, half hidden by overgrown sagebrush, was the beginning of a path, 2 faint ruts in the earth, barely visible but undeniably present. Her grandfather had told the truth. The place was real. The path led into a narrow canyon, and as the walls rose around them, the last of the daylight was swallowed. She walked by the light of a rising moon, the silver light making ghosts of the rocks. The air grew still and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. After what felt like an hour, the canyon walls fell away, and she stepped out into a small, circular valley, cupped in the palm of a ring of dark, silent mountains. And there it was. Sorrowful Creek. It was not a creek, and it was not sorrowful. It was a town. A small, silent, sleeping town. A single street, wider than a wagon, was lined with a dozen buildings, their shapes stark and geometric in the moonlight. A large building with a false front on the left, a general store. Across from it, a solid-looking structure with a wide, barn-like door, a smithy. Further down, a small building with a simple steeple, the cross still intact. A church. And scattered amongst them, 5 small, identical houses, each with a porch and a single stone chimney. The silence was absolute. No dogs barking, no lamplight in the windows, no wisp of smoke from the chimneys. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the dry grass that grew in the middle of the street. Fen pressed against her leg, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Audra placed a hand on his head, stilling him. She was not afraid. This was not a place of horror. It was a place of profound and utter stillness, a place that had been left, not destroyed. It felt like holding your breath. She walked slowly down the center of the street, her footsteps and the soft padding of Fen's paws the only sounds. The buildings were weathered, the wood bleached to a pale, silvery gray, but they were not rotten. The roofs were mostly intact. The windows were dark, hollow eyes, some with panes of glass still miraculously unbroken. It was as if the inhabitants had simply walked away one afternoon and never come back. She chose the house at the very end of the street, the one closest to the canyon mouth. It was no different from the others, but it felt right. The porch steps groaned under her weight but held. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust, dry wood, and the faint, sweet scent of long-dead mice. Moonlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating a single room. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small, cast-iron cookstove beside it. A narrow door led to what was likely a small bedroom. It was empty, but it was solid. It was shelter. It was hers. She dropped her sack on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud. She sank onto one of the chairs, the wood solid beneath her, and for the first time since leaving her aunt's house, the full weight of her exhaustion, her grief, and her bone-deep loneliness settled over her. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury she had unlearned long ago. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her forehead on the dusty table, and breathed. Just breathed. In and out. Fen came and laid his heavy head on her lap, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the floor. Here, in the heart of a forgotten town, under the silent watch of the mountains, Audra began. The first week was a ritual of reclamation. Audra moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that belied her age. It was the rhythm of a life spent working, where wasted energy was a cost she could not afford. Each day, she focused on a single, monumental task. The first was water. The deed had mentioned a well, and she found it behind her chosen house, covered with heavy, rotted planks. Fen watched, head cocked, as she hauled the planks away one by one, her muscles screaming in protest. The well was stone-lined, deep and dark. She lowered the old wooden bucket on a fraying rope, her heart pounding. The rope went slack, and she heard a faint, distant splash. She hauled it up, hand over hand, the rope biting into her palms. The bucket that emerged was heavy, sloshing with water that was cold, clear, and tasted of stone and deep earth. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She laughed, a short, rusty sound, and drank until she could drink no more, then filled her cup again and again for Fen, who lapped it up eagerly. With water secured, she turned to the house itself. It was a fortress of dust. She swept the floors with a broom made from a branch and stiff grasses, raising thick, choking clouds that billowed out the open door. She scrubbed the floorboards, the table, and the chairs with water and a rag torn from her spare shift, the clean, damp scent of wood slowly overpowering the smell of decay. She found a small bed frame in the back room, its rope supports rotted away. She spent an entire afternoon painstakingly reweaving the support with the rope from the well, which she replaced with a newer, stronger rope she found in the smithy. She had no mattress, but she gathered armfuls of dry, sweet-smelling grass from the valley floor and piled it high on the ropes, covering it with her blanket. It was a better bed than any she had slept in for a decade. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the valley was a physical presence. It pressed in on her, broken only by the cry of a hunting owl or the distant howl of a coyote. On the third night, a storm rolled in over the mountains. She sat at the table, watching the lightning flash, the thunder echoing like cannon fire through the valley. Rain hammered on the roof, and a steady drip began near the fireplace. She placed her tin cup on the floor to catch the water, the rhythmic plink. Plink. Plink, a tiny, metallic heartbeat in the cavernous silence. She was not afraid of the storm. She was grateful for the sound. It was a reminder that the world outside this valley still turned. Fen, who hated thunder, laid with his head on her feet, trembling slightly, and she rested a hand on his back until the storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet dust and sage. Her food was running low. The bread and cheese were long gone. She had found a small, overgrown vegetable patch behind the house, and after a day of pulling weeds, she was rewarded with a handful of gnarled, hardy potatoes and some woody carrots. She boiled them in her skillet over a small fire in the hearth, the first hot meal she had eaten in days. It was a meager feast, but it was hers, grown from her own land. She started exploring the other buildings, moving with a quiet reverence. The general store was a tomb of failed commerce. The shelves were empty, but behind the counter she found a ledger, its pages filled with transactions from 20 years ago. Names she didn't know, buying flour, nails, and cloth. On the last page, the ink was shaky. Supplies cut off. Quinn can't get through. Praying for relief. The entry was dated May 1868. The smithy was full of tools, coated in a fine layer of rust but otherwise sound. Hammers, tongs, files. The great bellows was cracked and dry, but the forge itself was solid stone. The church was the most unsettling. The pews were empty, a hymnal left open on one of them, the pages stiff and yellowed. On the simple altar, there was no cross, no candle, just a thick layer of dust. It was a place of faith abandoned in a hurry. Each discovery added a new layer to the mystery. This was not a town that had slowly died. It was a town that had been silenced. One afternoon, while patching the hole in her roof with shingles scavenged from a collapsed woodshed, she saw him. A rider, a dark shape moving slowly at the edge of the valley. Fen saw him too, and let out a single, sharp bark. Audra froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She slid down from the roof, her hand automatically going to the heavy hammer she'd been using. She stood in the shadow of the doorway, watching as the rider approached. He was a man, old and weathered, on a lean horse. He stopped 100 yards from her house, sitting straight in his saddle, just looking. He wasn't threatening, just watchful. Finally, he nudged his horse forward, stopping about 20 feet from her porch. He had a long, grey beard and eyes that were narrowed against the sun, crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of looking at distant horizons. "This is private land," Audra said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over her, the house, the evidence of her work. "Reckon it is," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Didn't figure anyone was left to claim it. Name's Abram." Audra, she offered nothing more. "Been ranching this country for 40 years, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the mountains. "Never seen anyone stay in this valley for more than a winter. The place has a bad name. Unlucky." "I have the deed," she stated flatly. "A deed don't scare off bad luck," he replied, his eyes lingering on the newly patched roof. "Folks who tried to settle here before, they just disappeared. Left everything behind. Like the ground swallowed them up. Or something ran them off." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Just thought you should know what kind of ground you're standing on." "I know what kind of ground it is," Audra said, her chin lifting slightly. "It's mine." Mr. Abram looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even respect, in his old eyes. He gave a curt nod. "Suit yourself." He turned his horse without another word and rode away, disappearing back the way he had come. Audra watched him go, her knuckles white on the handle of the hammer. She had not been run off. She had been acknowledged. It felt like a victory, but a grim one. The valley had a history, a dark one, and she was now a part of it. That night, she sat by her small fire, the flame pushing back the immense darkness, and felt the first cold touch of real fear. It wasn't the silence or the solitude she feared. It was the not knowing. The rancher's warning settled over the valley like a fine dust, making the silence feel heavier, the shadows deeper. Audra found herself watching the ridge line, half expecting to see Mr. Abram or some other figure watching her. But there was nothing. Only the wind and the hawks circling on the thermals. The fear slowly receded, replaced by a renewed, stubborn resolve. This place was not unlucky, it was simply empty. And she was filling it. Her focus narrowed again to the immediate, the tangible. The house was her world. With the roof patched and the interior clean, she turned her attention to the fireplace. It was the heart of the home, and it needed to be safe and sound before the cold weather truly set in. It was built of river rock, expertly fitted together, but decades of heating and cooling had cracked the mortar in places. She had found a small sack of dried lime powder in the smithy, and she mixed it with sand from the wash and water from the well, creating a rough, serviceable mortar. She worked carefully, chipping out the old, crumbling material with the tip of a trowel she'd found. It was slow, patient work. As she ran her hand over the stones, checking for loose ones, she thought of her grandfather's words. "Learn to see what doesn't belong." She was examining the area just above the firebox, a large, flat keystone supporting the chimney breast, when her fingers brushed against something different. A line of mortar, thinner than the others, and a slightly different color, more gray than the yellowish tan of the original. It was almost imperceptible. Had she not been looking, truly looking, she would have missed it. Her breath caught. She pressed on the stone below the line. It was solid. She pressed on the keystone itself. It didn't move. She went back to the thin line of mortar and scraped at it with her trowel. It came away easily, crumbling into powder, unlike the rock-hard mortar elsewhere. It was newer. Someone had sealed this place up after the original construction. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Using the edge of the trowel and a small hammer, she began to carefully chip away at the seal. It took an hour. The line of grey mortar traced the outline of a single, large stone to the right of the keystone. Once the seal was broken, she put her tools down and pressed her fingers into the crack she had made. She pulled. The stone resisted, then scraped, and finally pivoted inward on some unseen hinge. It was a door. Behind it was a dark, square cavity, just big enough to hold a small chest. It was made of metal, bound with iron straps, and coated in a thin layer of soot. It was heavy. She had to use both hands to wrestle it out, her arms trembling with exertion and anticipation. She set it on the hearth, her hands filthy, her breathing shallow. Fen came over and sniffed at the box, whining softly, as if he could smell the years sealed inside it. There was no lock, just a simple, heavy latch. She lifted it, the metal groaning in protest. The lid creaked open. The air that escaped smelled of old paper, leather, and something else, a faint, metallic tang. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried wool, were 3 objects. The first was a book, a thick ledger bound in dark brown leather, the cover unmarked. The second was a small, heavy pouch made of deerskin, tied shut with a leather thong. And the third was a stone. A flat, grey river stone, worn smooth by time and water. Running through its heart, like a frozen bolt of lightning, was a vein of pure white quartz. Audra's hand flew to her pocket. She pulled out the stone her grandfather had given her all those years ago. She held it up in the dusty light streaming from the window, then looked at the stone in the box. They were identical. Not just similar. Identical. 2 halves of the same thought, the same memory. The same story. A choked sound escaped her throat. She sank to her knees on the stone hearth, her own stone in one palm, her grandfather's in the other. They were cool, solid, and real. For 20 years, this box had waited. For her. The mystery of Sorrowful Creek was not in the empty buildings or the silent street. It was here, in this box, waiting to be read. Audra carried the lockbox to the table as if it were a holy relic. She untied the deerskin pouch first, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She tipped it over, and onto the rough wooden surface spilled a cascade of gold coins. Double eagles, $20 gold pieces, their luster dulled by time but their weight undeniable. She counted them slowly, stacking them in small piles. There were 50 in total. $1,000. It was not a fortune, but to a woman who had started her journey with $7, it was the wealth of a queen. It was enough to buy supplies for a year, to purchase livestock, to hire help. It was enough to build a life. She pushed the gold aside and reached for the ledger. The leather cover was soft and worn, smooth under her fingertips. She opened it. The first page was a map, beautifully hand-drawn in black ink. It was a map of the valley, showing the town, the well, the path to the canyon, and the surrounding mountains. And in the corner, in her grandfather's familiar script, was the name he had given it, Haven. She turned the page. The rest of the book was a journal, the entries beginning in the spring of 1865. April 10th, 1865. We have found it. The valley is as the Ute described. Sheltered, with good water and timber. Hidden from the main pass. Here we will build. Here we will be free. I have named it Haven, for that is what it will be. A place of refuge for those hunted not for crimes, but for circumstance. For the sharecropper buried in a debt he can never repay, for the family fleeing a company town that owns them body and soul, for the soldier who has seen enough of killing. This will not be a town of gold seekers and gamblers, but of builders and growers. A place to you and become who you were, and become who you are meant to be. Audra read on, her fingers tracing the elegant, faded script. Page after page, her grandfather's voice spoke to her from across the years, and the story of the town, of Haven, unfolded. He and 4 other families had founded it together. They had pooled their resources, worked the land, and built the town from nothing. They had deliberately kept it off the maps, their only connection to the outside world a trusted freighter who brought them what they could not make themselves. For 3 years, they had lived in peace. The journal was filled with the small details of their lives, the birth of a child, the success of the first harvest, the raising of the church steeple. Then, the tone of the entries began to change. May 5, 1868. A man came today. A surveyor for the railroad, he said, but his eyes were for the water. He spoke of a land baron, a man named Sterling, who is buying up all the grazing rights north of the Cinderwoods. He covets this valley. I can see it. He offered to buy us out. We refused. This land is not for sale. June 12, 1868. Our freighter, Mr. Quinn, was turned back at the pass. He was met by armed men wearing Sterling's brand. They told him this was private property now. Our supply line is cut. We have enough to last the winter, but if we cannot get supplies by spring, we are finished. September 2nd, 1868. Sterling's men are a constant presence now. They do not attack. They simply watch from the ridges. They have begun to spread rumors in Prosperity that our valley is cursed, that it is a place of sickness. They mean to isolate us, to make us a ghost story before we are even ghosts. The final entry was dated October 1st, 1868. The ink was hurried, slightly smeared. He has won. Not with guns, but with paper and fear. He has a warrant, a claim from some corrupt judge in the capital, stating this land is his. We cannot fight the law, not when it is bought and paid for. To stay is to be arrested as squatters. To fight is to be killed. We have made a decision. We will not give him the satisfaction of seeing us defeated. We will simply vanish. Tonight, we leave. We will scatter to the four winds, taking nothing but what we can carry. We will leave the town standing as a monument to what we built, and a testament to the greed that destroyed it. I have hidden this journal, and what little gold we have left, for the future. Perhaps one day, someone with a rightful claim will find it. My granddaughter, Audra, holds the true deed, passed down from my father. I have sent it to her, in the hopes it will one day find her. If it is you, my little bird, who finds this, know that this land was built on a dream of justice. The dream is not dead. It is only sleeping. The choice is yours. Avenge us, or rebuild us. Either way, do not let us be forgotten. Audra closed the book. The silence of the room was filled with the ghosts of those families, their hopes, and their quiet, dignified retreat. Her grandfather hadn't left her a ruin, he had left her a legacy. The rancher, Mr. Abram, had been right. The people had been run off. The curse was not supernatural, it was the long shadow of a rich man's greed. She looked at the gold, then at the ledger, then at the two stones sitting side by side on the table. Avenge, or rebuild? She had no power to avenge. She had no interest in fighting shadows from the past. But rebuilding was something she understood. It was in her hands, in her blood. She picked up her grandfather's ledger and, on the first clean page at the back, she dipped a dry pen into a makeshift ink of soot and water. In clear, careful letters, she wrote an account of the town of Haven. Refounded by Audra, October 1888. A week later, a wagon appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Audra was splitting firewood when she heard the jingle of a harness, and she straightened up, her hand resting on the axe handle. Fen stood beside her, alert but not aggressive. It was not Mr. Abram's horse. This was a sturdy buckboard wagon, pulled by two mules and driven by a woman. The woman pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and set the brake. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and capable hands that rested on the reins. "You must be the one," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Eleanor Finch. My husband is the station master at Prosperity." Audra nodded, silent. It was Mrs. Finch's husband who had called the land snakes and disappointment. "Mr. Abram came through a few days ago," Mrs. Finch continued, undeterred by Audra's silence. "He told us about you. Said you were tough as a boiled owl." She smiled a little. "He also said you looked like you could use a friend. I brought you some things." She gestured to the back of the wagon. It was loaded with sacks of flour and beans, a crate of tinned goods, jars of preserves, and a bundle of quilts. It was a treasure trove. Audra felt a strange tightness in her throat. For a decade, no one had offered her anything without expecting twice its value in labor. "I can pay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She thought of the gold coins hidden under a loose floorboard. Mrs. Finch's smile widened. "I'm sure you can. But this isn't for sale. It's a welcome. It's a hard country to make a go of it alone. She paused, her gaze taking in the clean-swept porch, the patched roof, the neat stack of firewood. Though it looks like you're making a fine start. For the first time, Audra felt the rigid wall of her solitude begin to crack. This woman was not offering charity, she was offering community. An alliance. Thank you, Audra said, the words feeling inadequate. Will you stay for coffee? I have no coffee, but I can boil water for tea. I found some mint growing by the wash. I'd like that very much, Mrs. Finch said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. As they sat at the simple table, drinking mint tea from tin cups, Audra made a decision. She did not tell Mrs. Finch about the gold, or the full story in the ledger. The world had too many men like Sterling in it. But she told her the town's real name was Haven. And she told her she intended to stay. I have the means to purchase supplies regularly, Audra said carefully. If you know a reliable freighter. My grandfather used a man named Quinn. Mrs. Finch's eyes lit up. James Quinn. Of course. He still runs freight through these parts. He's an honest man. He'd be glad for the business, I'm sure. He lost a lot of contracts when the mining boom went bust a few years back. Will you tell him I wish to hire him? Audra asked. Tell him to come to Haven. When Mrs. Finch left that afternoon, leaving the bounty of supplies on Audra's porch, she also left something more valuable, a connection. A thread stretching from the isolated valley back to the world of people. That evening, Audra opened her new ledger. Under her first entry, she made a second, received from Mrs. Finch, flour, beans, sundries. Debt of kindness. To be repaid. She had started her grandfather's work. She was rebuilding. The arrival of James Quinn's freight wagon 2 weeks later marked the true turning point for Haven. It was a massive, sturdy vehicle pulled by a team of 4 powerful horses, and it announced its arrival with a loud rumble that echoed through the valley. Mr. Quinn was a man whose body seemed shaped by his work, broad shoulders, thick arms, a face tanned to leather by sun and wind. With him was his son, Jesse, a quiet young man of 18 with his father's solid build but his mother's watchful eyes. Mr. Quinn greeted Audra with a firm handshake. Mrs. Finch sent word. Said you had a standing order. I confess, I never thought I'd be hauling freight to this valley again. My father was the one who used to come here, back when it was first settled. Your father was friends with my grandfather, Audra said, and the connection solidified the trust between them instantly. She gave him her list, written carefully on a page torn from the back of the old ledger. Nails, glass for the windows, seed for a spring garden, salt, sugar, coffee, and 2 good axes. She paid him for the goods and for his time with 3 of the gold double eagles. Quinn's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the coins, but he asked no questions, simply nodding and making a note in his own book. He was a man who understood the value of discretion. While they unloaded the supplies, his son Jesse wandered the silent street, his hands in his pockets. He didn't say a word, but Audra saw him looking at everything, his gaze lingering on the sagging roof of the smithy, the broken door of the general store. When his father was ready to leave, Jesse approached Audra, his eyes on the ground. He said, his voice low. The bellows in the smithy, the leather is shot. But the frame is good. I could fix it. I know how. Audra looked at the boy, who seemed to flinch under her direct gaze. He was not offering his labor for pay. He was offering it because he saw a thing that was broken and knew how to make it whole again. He was a builder. I would be grateful, she said simply. So Jesse stayed. He moved into one of the other small houses, and from dawn until dusk, the valley was filled with the sounds of his work, the rhythmic rasp of a saw, the clean strike of a hammer. He was tireless and methodical. He repaired the smithy bellows with new leather Quinn brought on his next trip. He rehung the door on the general store. He replaced the broken panes in Audra's windows, letting in the clear, bright light of the valley. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. Word of Haven began to spread, carried by Quinn on his freight runs and by Mrs. Finch at the station. It was a slow rumor, a whisper of a place in the scablands where a lone woman was making a stand. And the whispers found ears that needed to hear them. One evening, a lone figure on foot appeared on the path. It was a woman, not much older than Audra, her face pale with exhaustion and her dress travel-stained. She carried a single, small carpet bag. She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, a widow from a town 2 days east. Her husband had died, and his brother had laid claim to their farm, leaving her with nothing. She had heard a rumor of a place where a woman could be safe, a place where she could start again. Audra looked at this woman, and she saw herself, just a few months prior. She saw one of the people her grandfather had dreamed of giving refuge to. "There is a house," Audra said, pointing to the one next to her own. "It is empty. You can have it. There is work to be done, if you are willing." Tears welled in Mrs. Gable's eyes. "I can cook, and I can sew. And I know herbs. My mother was a healer." "Then you are welcome here," Audra said. "You are welcome in Haven." That night, Audra took a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She went to the newly planed wood of her cabin's interior door, and beside the frame, she wrote the names. Audra. Jessie. Mrs. Gable. It was not a ledger of accounts. It was a record of belonging. A town was not just buildings and a name on a map. A town was people. And Haven, once a ghost, was beginning to have a pulse. The valley changed with the seasons. The silence of autumn, broken only by Jess's hammer, gave way to the deeper quiet of winter, when snow blanketed the town and the smoke from 3 chimneys rose straight and thin into the cold, clear air. They were lean months, but they were not hungry. The supplies from Quinn, supplemented by Audra's potatoes and Mrs. Gable's skill at finding edible roots and preserving what little they had, saw them through. The 3 of them, Audra the founder, Jessie the builder, and Mrs. Gable the hearth-keeper, formed a quiet, functional family. When the spring thaw came, it felt like a resurrection. The creek at the bottom of the valley, which Audra had assumed was forever dry, began to flow with snowmelt from the mountains, a ribbon of silver in the greening grass. The name Sorrowful Creek was finally, truly, a lie. They planted a large garden behind the houses, the rich valley soil turning easily under the spade. Jessie, using the now functional smithy, forged new hinges and repaired old tools. Mrs. Gable's knowledge of herbs produced remedies for coughs and salves for cuts. Audra managed it all, her ledger now filling with lists of supplies needed, tasks completed, and trades arranged. James Quinn's wagon became a regular, welcome sight. He brought news of the outside world, and he took back stories of Haven's slow, steady growth. He started bringing more than just supplies. One trip, he brought a crate of chickens. Another, a pregnant sow. He refused payment for them. An investment, he said, with a wink. In my most reliable customers. Then, one day in early summer, Mr. Abram returned. He rode into the valley not with suspicion, but with open curiosity. He saw the green garden, the smoke from the smithy, the chickens scratching in the dirt. He saw Jessie mending a fence and Mrs. Gable hanging laundry on a line. He saw life. He stopped his horse in front of Audra's house. She was on the porch, mending a sack. She did not stand, but watched him approach, her hand still. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect he had not offered on his first visit. He said. His eye scanned the small, thriving settlement. "You've been busy." "There is always work to be done," Audra replied. "I see that," he said. He was quiet for a long moment, watching a child's dress, one Mrs. Gable had sewn for a doll, a touch of whimsy in their practical world, flutter on the line. "The curse seems to have lifted." "There was no curse," Audra said softly. "Just bad men. And forgotten stories." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had long suspected. "The water in this valley is the best in the territory. My herd is struggling on the North Range. The creeks are running dry." He hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "I was wondering if you'd be amenable to a trade. Grazing rights for a few dozen head in your lower pasture. In exchange for a share of the calves." and my men would help keep watch on the pass. Make sure no one comes bothering you. It was a peace treaty, an offer of alliance from the world that had once shunned this valley. It was vindication, quiet and profound. I think that can be arranged, Mr. Abram, Audra said. Welcome to Haven. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Audra stood on her porch. Fen rested at her feet, his head on his paws. The air was filled with the sounds of a living town, the lowing of Abram's cattle in the distance, the clang of Jess's hammer from the smithy, the sound of Mrs. Gable humming in her kitchen. Inside her house, on the mantelpiece above the fireplace where it all began, sat a small altar to her new life. The 2 river stones, her grandfather's and her own, lay side by side. Next to them stood his leather-bound ledger, filled with a sleeping dream, and beside it, her own, open and filling with the reality of its waking. She had not sought vengeance. She had chosen to rebuild. And in doing so, she had built not just a town, but a home. She had filled the emptiness, not just in the valley, but inside herself. They say you can't build a life on ghosts and dust. But what if the ghosts leave you a blueprint and a reason? What if the dust is just a fallow field, waiting for the right hands to tend it? Look around at the empty spaces in your own life, the forgotten dreams and the abandoned hopes. What would you build with them? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more tales of quiet corners and resilient hearts.